There you go. All right.
I was like,
They put me in charge of something and it was a problem. Welcome everyone to Putnam Valley Library. I'm so excited to have all of you here tonight. I'm going to start with safety things. These doors do not go anywhere. In the event of an emergency, you will be headed towards the illuminated red exit sign, please, in a orderly fashion. We have someone in charge of the fire extinguisher, but we should. My other usual shtick for safety at the Putnam Valley Library is we are in Putnam Valley. Power is a little winky wonky sometimes. If the power goes out, those of you who are residents know, just hang tight a second. Yeah, probably come right back. If not, flashlights will be guiding you out. That said, I want to thank you all for coming again. This lecture is going to be the first presentation of the library's year-long celebration of the 250th anniversary or birthday of our country. It's going to be a series of programs all year. We're going to talk about different aspects of the revolution and the birth of our country. Some programs may cover all the way through to today. Some programs will cover other aspects. It won't just be war, doom, gloom, and celebration as well. But yes, we do plan to spend the whole year talking about this. To that end, I've created one link that will take you to our registration page that will show you everything that's on the schedule coming up. That was in all of the emails that I've been sending out, and it will be on all of our social media posts and our website. It's bit.ly/PVLRev250. I will test you on this later. But like I said, you'll be able to find it in all of our communications about the 250th this year. This way, you can stay ahead of me putting stuff out on the web. You can just see it, register, and we'll see you for those programs. That said, I will have 2 programs next month. It's going to be a 2-part lecture series. The first one is the history and culture of the first peoples of the Hudson Valley. It's going to look at the Iroquois, the Mohican, the Wappingers people. And then we're going to also have the second part's going to be on the plight of the Ramapo people, which is going to be a very interesting discussion. There will be conversation as part of this, as well as a short documentary within the second part. So I hope you guys stay with us all year long. You may have noticed that we usually have our programs next door. We are in here today, this cozy little atmosphere, because we are currently doing construction next door. This year, next door. We're revitalizing the space, thanks to the board and thanks to some grant funding and thanks to members of the town. We are able to do a much needed and seriously beautiful facelift next door. I was there yesterday, and I'm so excited to bring programs back into that space. We'll have a little bit more go room. So I hope you stick with us throughout the year. We'll be next door, hopefully in a few weeks. And with that, I'm going to introduce our presenter today, Matthew. Matthew is a Putnam Valley resident from 1993. He has a deep interest in American history since the age of 16. He concluded a 32-year career in communication at the auction house in Sotheby's, with 9 years as worldwide director of sales communication based in London. For the past 4 years, Matthew has served as the historical interpreter at Washington's headquarters state historic site, just up in Newburgh, where he enjoys illuminating visitors and audiences about the significant achievements of George Washington, the indispensable man of the American Revolution during the war's final 16 months. In addition to his historical work, Matthew is an avid horticulturist. He volunteers as a master gardener with the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Putnam County, serves as honorary president of the Phillipstown Garden Club, writes regularly for the Garden Club of America magazine bulletin, and lectures on historical horticulture. With that, Matthew.
Thank you, Cole, for that introduction. Okay, before I start, I want you to know the reason I'm standing here. I am standing here today, it's all to do with the librarian. Joan Stone. Coming to the library for about 5 years now, researching articles for the magazine I write for, and Joan could not have been more welcome. After she heard about some talks I'd given elsewhere, she said, I think you should be talking. So here, she put me together. Cole, who absolutely could not have been more enthusiastic about the topic that I had suggested. So basically, I'm here because this town has two top-notch immigrants. Now, the reason I'm here, so that's the reason I'm here today. The reason I'm here today is to do with the fact that 250 years ago, in Philadelphia, Thomas Paine's Common Sense was published. It was a runaway bestseller and the most important pamphlet in American history, hands down. But since the talk is going to give you more context for that, without further ado, let's begin. Which clicker? Where do I point this?
It should just be click to the right.
Clicked.
Yep.
Oh,
You hit another button. Going too far.
what?
It blacked out. There you go.
All right. Do I have too powerful a click? Anyhow, okay, so the revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution. So Adams said that in 1818. So what is the American Revolution? When did it begin? Many people do erroneously believe the war for American independence began in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. But we know, of course, that hostilities began more than a year earlier on April 19, 1775 in Lexington, Massachusetts, with the monumental action I'm sure we've all heard of before the shot heard round the world. But many historians in recent years like to argue for an earlier date, as John Adams suggests here in this excellent quote. Indeed, the events of the preceding decade and beyond are vitally important to understanding the context of the war, why both sides felt justified in the cause, and ultimately, why the United States was molded into the nation we know today by our founding fathers and the will of the Americans. It is a great fact of history that no great conflict exists on its own, but is rather part of a long pattern of competing agendas, causes and effects, actions and reactions. So, in order to understand this war, we must first take a glance at the previous. All right. What Americans know as the French and Indian War was merely the North American theater of the much larger globally fought conflict known as the 7 Years' War. To explain all the rivalries, alliances, sub-wars, the conflicting agendas which take vastly too long, involving some 200 years or more of European geopolitics. Suffice it to say that in 1754, tension began between two of Europe's greatest power, Great Britain and France. Gotta watch it real quick. Very sensitive. So tensions between Britain and France were at an extreme high. It began in what was then the western frontier of North America, known as the Ohio Country. This is a loose geographical region that comprises what is now Ohio, western Pennsylvania, eastern Indiana, northern West Virginia, and northern Kentucky. So it's a huge area. Competing claims to this beaver-rich region between French and British fur trappers and merchants, as well as the numerous indigenous tribes, spread throughout and around the region finally erupted into war when, on May 28th, 1754, a force of 52 Virginia militiamen and indigenous warriors ambushed a force of 40 French Canadians at the Battle of Newburgh. That's near modern day Uniontown, Pennsylvania. So this Virginia militia force was led by an ambitious 22-year-old Virginia planter, land surveyor, and slave owner. Can anyone name him? Correct. Yes, the French and Indian War, which exploded into the globally fought 7 Years' War, began in the forests of western Pennsylvania under the command of George Washington. Over the subsequent years, this North American theater of the war would shift between the Ohio country to far upstate New York, before finally ending with the British conquest of French Canada after the fall of Montreal in 1760. The Treaty of Paris in 1763, which officially ended the 7 Years' War and its numerous regional proxies, saw a dramatic reshuffle of borders and power in North America. But before we get into any of the consequences of the war, let's get a snapshot of who these Americans are and what their relationship with the mother country is. For it needs to be said at the outset that if we had not been predominantly British colonists relying on the British institutions of politics and government and traditions of personal liberty stretching back to Magna Carta, it's 1215, remember, we would never have become the America we know today. By the time of the French and Indian War, all 13 colonies had robust political institutions, provincial assemblies or legislatures, county, town, parish governments. Americans were self-governed, and they had accomplished this during the extended period when they were largely left alone by the mother country, which was preoccupied with its own bitter civil war. The largest component of the population was English, but population growth and physical expansion had diluted English dominance and basically changed its texture. Nearly 1/5 of the population were people of color, enslaved people brought by force from Africa and the West Indies. Next in predominance were the Scots-Irish. That's another forced migration. The Scots and English Presbyterians could move to Ireland in the 17th century to evade persecution by the Anglican majority. But they were later driven by English policies that barred them from holding civil and military office, or that discriminated against Irish wool, cattle, and linen, and thus they were prevented from earning a living. In Ireland, that's what the Anglican majority did to the Protestants. The Protestant majority imposed the so-called penal laws on Irish Catholics. These restricted their freedom to educate their children, to carry arms, to inherit, own, or work land, and to enter professions. And finally, in 1728, a restriction that they're not allowed to vote. So these refugees from the British Isles who had endured poverty or who had strained to get a living under religious persecution were driven to America by desperate conditions. And also, let's face it, by something within themselves. They were joined by Germans, Dutch, and others who'd come for similar reasons. Whether they were stronger or not than those who had stayed in Europe, they had resisted. They had fled. They had almost self-selected not to stand further oppression, poverty, or persecution. But to get back to 1763, the enormous financial strain that the French and Indian War put upon the British government was immensely consequential for the colonial period. Like all wars, victory for the British and, of course, their closest allies, the American colonists, came at great monetary expense. And the British government found itself massively in debt despite its great victory. Prior to the war, the crown was in debt to the sum of 75 million pounds. By war's end, that debt had almost doubled to 133 million pounds. Adjusted for inflation, those numbers jumped to 13.8 trillion and $24.6 trillion. Truly a massive sum. Compounding this issue was the ongoing British military occupation of the Ohio country. To help secure these newly conquered lands and to quell the uprising indigenous tribes that had sided with the French or felt cheated by the British government placed a force of 10,000 troops throughout the region. They then issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade Western colonial expansion past the Appalachian Mountain range into the Ohio country. So they made that entire region an indigenous preserve. These actions greatly angered the American colonists. They felt cheated out of great business and agricultural opportunities, and they largely ignored it. In the British Parliament, there was a simple solution to their financial needs: tax the colonies. Leading parliamentarians at the time, while certainly thankful to the American colonists fought alongside them, reasoned that the colonists should pay for just a portion of colonial defense. So, on April 5th, 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. It's meant to serve as a revenue-raising measure. The act actually cut the rate on sugar and molasses in half, but provided for stricter enforcement of the actual collection of the tax. Despite the reduced rate, American merchants viewed this as an attack on their commercial interests. It was well known that they'd been ignoring taxes prior to this, so any enforcement of tax collection is a threat regardless of the rate. Thus began a new post-war period of controversial parliamentary acts that slowly increased tensions between the 13 colonies and Great Britain. The following year, 1765, why does it do that?
There is a button on there that just turns the screen off.
And I see Samantha.
You found it.
Yeah.
All right, maybe my thumbs are too small. The following year, 1765, brought one of the most infamous, the stamp. So often mistakenly thought of as a tax on stamps, it was in fact a tax on the transfer of any official document. So this includes checks, mortgages, contracts, marriage licenses, even newspapers. Once the tax was paid, the document would receive an official stamp, hence the name. This act resulted in massive public outcry in the colonies, as it was seen as a violation of their rights as British citizens. It is here that we see the first appearance of a now famous revolutionary declaration: no taxation without representation. Interestingly, this was actually said by a Whig member of Parliament, Charles Camden, first Earl Camden, who was more sympathetic to the desires of the colonists than the ruling Tory establishment. And reading the statements of the Whig establishment against, or the Whigs against the Tory establishment, makes for some pretty interesting reading. They saw exactly what was happening to us. So the Whigs were the liberals, just interesting. Protests against the Stamp Act were held across the colonies, often organized by the famous Sons of Liberty. Most notably, from October 7th to the 25th, 27 delegates from 9 colonies met in New York in what is known as the Stamp Act Congress to draft formal petitions to Parliament, declaring that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies as the colonies were insufficiently represented within Parliament. In the next year, 1766, Parliament firmly rejected this notion. The Declaratory Act officially codified Parliament's power to tax the colonies without any colonial representation. So they just passed a law saying, we can tax you. We have all right to tax you without any influence. So 1765 also brought the first of the hated quartering acts. So it declared that British regulars stationed in New York, whose presence was already a point of contention as the colonies were at peace, were to be housed in local barracks and public houses. If, however, those houses were full, then regulars were to be housed in inns, stables, alehouses, private homes of liquor merchants, uninhabited houses, and barns. New York City officials flatly rejected this and refused to comply, as the cost of sheltering and feeding those soldiers would fall onto the colonists, not the Parliament. Now, one of the things in American history that we need to understand is American resistance to a standing army. So a standing army is defined as an army in peacetime. It's basically seen as you have no need to have a standing army unless you want to enforce tyranny. And that's a standard in American history, which I think holds to this day. So political and legal standoff ensued, and British troops were forced to remain quartered on their ships in New York Harbor. 1767 and 68 brought the Townsend Acts. So this is a series of 5 acts meant to raise revenue on the sale of 5 necessary commodities: paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. Also, and listen to this, to fund loyal state governors, enforce trade restrictions to stifle American commerce, and to punish New York for failing to comply with the Quartering Act.
But yeah,
So
things don't change.
exploded across the colonies in what was against what was seen as an unconstitutional and inflammatory overreach by England. Protests ensued, culminating in 1770 in the infamous Boston Massacre, where a crowd of 300 to 4,000 colonists, hurling various small projectiles and verbal insults, were fired upon by 9 British soldiers, resulting in 5 deaths and 6 injured victims. You are looking here at one of the most famous propaganda images in American history. So the truth of the matter is that you've got a few British soldiers and a mob of hundreds, if not thousands, throwing rocks and snowballs and projectiles and insults at them. Somebody fires. Needless to say, it wasn't a firing squad like that, but Paul Revere got through to the American people with that image, which is famous to us. Actually, John Adams wanted to show the value of British institutions, and he actually defended those soldiers at a public trial, and he won, largely won. All these regulations and restrictions had an interesting effect on commerce in North America, and one that Parliament egregiously failed to foresee. A huge uptick in American smuggling ensued. Why not, right?
Uh-huh.
Although smuggling had been going on in the colonies almost since the beginning, as the American colonies were legally only allowed to trade with British merchants, which is obviously a severely stifling trade policy. The practice had become hugely popular by the early 1770s, and as trade with Britain simply became too expensive. Now, the British system also allowed the customs inspectors to hold a post in America and get paid, but to live in England and have deputies. Well, the deputies don't make as much as the customs officials, so they're pretty susceptible to getting bribes. So it's their own system that, basically prevented it. And one of the things that, or Grenville is going to do is tighten on that system. It's going to get rid of those slackers. Um, like good British subjects, no product was more enticing to smugglers than tea. In the 1770, smugglers imported some 900,000 pounds of illegal foreign tea, mostly Dutch, compared to a measly 562,000 pounds of legal British tea imported by legitimate merchants. Um, this resulted in a massive loss of profit for the East India Trading Company. Uh, Now, East India Trading Company is an organization of vital importance to Britain's colonial agenda. How is all this smuggling taking place? Have any of you ever studied a map of the east coast of the United States? There are so many inlands and rivers and bays and places where you can make an entrance. And it stretches 1,400 miles. So, good luck enforcing that, even with the greatest navy in the world, which the British have certainly had. Anyhow, the East India Company is rapidly headed to bankruptcy. So they lobbied Parliament for more favorable terms and act on their behalf. So Parliament is ever the ally of British commercial interests and the enemy of American commercial interests. They need a little tea. So Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, allowing the company to sell their tea directly to the colonists, okay, thus bypassing American merchants. As the powerful company could charge immensely lower prices than the merchants, this act effectively granted a monopoly over the trade of tea in North America. So question, are the American tea merchants going to be made happy by that? No, you've alienated all of those. But that's not the worst of the act. Most importantly, the lower price that the East India Company was able to offer you included the tea tax. So by buying the tea, they're paying the tax, and that is establishing the precedent that the Parliament has the right to tax you, right? So once again, you have to be impressed. Outrage just immediately explodes. Protests rip across the country. The East India Company sent tea to all 13 colonies. The most famous reaction of the act, which I'm sure you're all familiar, was, of course, the Boston Tea Party. Okay, where the Sons of Liberty, disguised as indigenous people, boarded the British merchant ship Dartmouth and destroyed 342 chests of tea. In today's money, this would be worth roughly $1.7 million. So they basically take the tea out of the chests and throw it into Boston Harbor, which must look like a complete mess, right? Parliament considered the Boston Tea Party to be an act of treason, and they retaliated harshly. So the Tea Party is December 16th, 1773. In 1774, Parliament passes the brutal, what they're pleased to call the coercive acts, and those acts are known in the colonies as the intolerable acts. And they're aimed exclusively at punishing Massachusetts colonists for their perceived insurrection. So this is what the intolerable acts do. They close the port of Boston to all commerce, right? They revoke Massachusetts colonial charter, which they've had for 100 plus years. They place the colony under direct parliamentarian control. They allow for trials of royal officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be held in Britain. And they renew the previously mentioned argument. So the colonial situation was now reaching breaking. So in terms of the quartering act, the population of Boston at this time is 15,000. King George III sends in 4,000 British soldiers who are going to have to be courted by the Bostonian king. Okay, so 4,000 is more than one for every four Bostonians. So it's basically, and that includes women and children. So it basically amounts to one British soldier for every able-bodied man. Okay, pretty oppressive, right? American colonists saw these acts as unnecessarily cruel and vindictive, believing them to be a violation of their constitutional and natural rights as British citizens. Across the colonies, committees of correspondence were set up to coordinate the colonial agenda, ideology, and responses to these acts. These committees directly led to the very first step taken toward the path of American self-determination. On the 5th of September, 1774, 56 delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia in what is now known as the First Continental Congress. Now, you really have to admire the colonies. This is a time, I mean, the roads in Putnam County are pretty lousy now. Can you imagine what they're for times? And yet, what's happening in Boston is being reported in Virginia within weeks. It's pretty extraordinary. So everybody's hearing what happens to the Bostonians. They're sending food because what happens when the port's closed, right? There's no food coming in. There's no commerce. You can't earn a living if you were involved in any part of merchant enterprise. But the colonies are pulling together because these committees of correspondence, without the benefit of cell phones, are basically spreading this information. And Americans across the 13 colonies are feeling the plight of their Bostonian brethren. Okay, there we go. Okay, so here, our country's leading citizens agreed to a non-importation scheme known as the Continental Association, which is a total boycott of imported British goods to force parliamentary negotiations. This Congress was the first instance of mass colonial unification. So Britain says basically, we're going to hurt you by closing your harbor, canceling your representative institutions, and sending soldiers. And America responds by stopping to buy any British goods. Okay. So by early 1775, the country set to explode. Parliament declared Massachusetts to be the state of hell. In April, 700 British regulars were ordered to destroy military supplies held by the Massachusetts militia. Okay, so that's the First Continental Congress. Beautiful building. You can go see that today. So brave patriots, Paul Revere, Samuel Prescott, William Dawes, and an estimated 40 others rode through the night to alert the Massachusetts Minutemen of the impending assault. Grabbing their muskets from their mantles and rushing towards danger, 77 American patriots came face to face with 400 well-trained British soldiers at Lexington Green on the road to Concord, just as the sun was rising on April 19th. After a brief and tense exchange of words, one single musket shot rang out. One single musket shot rang out, and so the whole course of history is forever changed because hostilities began in the American countries. I will say that as soon as I'm finished with this lecture, I'm going to change into other clothes and drive to Boston to a party for my daughter's baby shower. And then Sunday, I'm going to go to the Minuteman National Park and see these events. And I'm terribly excited. So, sorry.
You shouldn't change clothes.
So George does plays, and usually I'm looking at him in cuss. How do you like it, George? Well. Okay, so the need for statewide cohesion was abundantly apparent. In May 1775, 60 delegates from all 13 colonies met in Philadelphia and formed the Second Continental Congress, which effectively served as our country's first unified government. They saw the need to raise a unified continental army, and after some deliberation, they agreed that only one man could unify the various state militias into an effective fighting force. And so, on June 15, 1775, Congress unanimously elected George Washington to be commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Ever a humble leader, Washington said in his acceptance speech that I am truly sensible of the high honor done me in this appointment. I do not think myself equal to the command I am under. Okay, so that's putting it mildly, George. He had only previously commanded 100 men. Okay, he's going to be commanding an army that was just created the day before, June 14th. He basically has to put together the militia of the various states and turn them into an army. And most people from one state hate the people of the other state. It's a huge, huge task. Never mind the fact that we don't have enough weapons. So it is an absolutely enormous task. Interestingly, it should be noted that at this time, independence is not the primary agenda for many of our founding fathers after they heard of the news of Lexington and Concord. So this is important to take this on. Even after the Battle of Bunker Hill, siege of Boston, the American invasion of British-held Canada at the end of the year, many leading Americans believed that reconciliation with Great Britain was not only possible, it was also the best outcome. So hold on. We need a time for it. If Americans thought reconciliation was possible, did they think they were fighting? Okay? In those battles that killed thousands. So this early commission in the fledgling Continental Army for a Connecticut officer, signed by Governor John Trumbull on May 15th, 1775, makes it clear. At this time, prior to the Declaration of Independence, the man was being appointed to deal with His Majesty's enemies. That is to say, the British army opposing them was considered to be the ministerial army of Parliament. They, the colonial army, were the king's troops upholding the rights of Englishmen. Amazing, right? Which is why it was perfectly logical on July 5th, 1775, for the Second Continental Congress to draft the Olive Branch Petition, which was a last-ditch effort to avoid war with Britain by appealing directly to King George III, claiming that the 13 colonies did not wish for independence, but rather a more justified set of tax regulations and trade agreements with the mother country. It ultimately fell on deaf ears. By the time the petition arrived in London, King George III had already issued the Proclamation of Rebellion, which declared the colonies of North America to be in an open and avowed rebellion. So even though the majority of Americans do not think they're in a state of rebellion, King George III tells them, you are. The king refused to read the Olive Branch Petition once it arrived, and so it was immediately raided. So this only further, so at this point, basically, colonists see themselves in resistance. England, the king, sees them in rebellion. So there's this cross purposes. They don't even understand what the others do. So this only further enlarged the domestic sentiment towards independence, the Olive Branch Petitions. On January 10th, 1776, a pamphlet was anonymously published in Philadelphia that presented an impassioned argument against monarchical government and for independence from Great Britain, based on morality, politics, and egalitarianism. This pamphlet soon became a national bestseller, the first of its kind in America, and was read aloud throughout the 13 colonies in community meetings, taverns, public gatherings. Thousands of previously unsure Americans, all of whom had been brought up as loyal subjects of the king. Think about that. Every American had been brought up as a loyal subject of the king. You thought of yourself as a loyal subject of the king for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, or in my case, 70 plus years. And all of a sudden, you're going to be thinking something. Common sense convinced this majority to support the cause of American independence by the pamphlet's logical and persuasive. Who in this room has read Common Sense? It is a document of extraordinary lucidity. It is aimed at, the common, right? Intelligence. It's no fancy language. John Adams looked at it and said, well, this is very high flow. Well, good, thank God. Nobody would have read it. Yeah. That's true. But I think today and in this spot, we can applaud the power of the written word. After some months, the author was finally revealed to be John Smith. By mid-1776, it had become obvious we passed the point of no return. So, on June 11, 1776, the Second Continental Congress created from amongst its members a committee of 5 to draft an official declaration. The group is composed of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Livingston, Roger Sherman, and Thomas Jefferson. After weeks of writing, consultation, debate, and rewriting, on July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress passed the unanimous Declaration of the United States of America. So, just in case we got there, I thought I'd bring if previously, so this is really important. The Declaration is something new in the history. If previously colonists had rejected parliamentary rule, in the Declaration of Independence, they list the train of 18 abuses and usurpations instituted by the king. So formerly, we opposed Congress. Now we're opposing the king. Recall some of the language. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. So if they're sending somebody to England to get tried, right, then you're being denied that right. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. In the Declaration, the representatives of the United Colonies solemnly publish and declare themselves to be free and independent states, absolve of all allegiance to the British Crown, and dissolving the political connection with Great Britain. This document marks the first official act of self-rule for the United States. Now famous and revered the world over, this document embodies our core American ideals of freedom and equality and justice for all people, justice before the law for all people. It's a standard to which our nation rallies behind. It's the lens through which we interpret ourselves and our government. It's a standard of principles which all Americans uphold, bound by honor to uphold. Over 8.5 years of war, America would fight on land, on sea, at home, and around the world for its future, for its freedom, for its very identity. We as a nation would experience crushing blows of defeat in battles at Quebec, New York, Brandywine, Camden, Guilford Courthouse, and many others. We'd experienced the euphoric highs of victory, patriotism in battles at Trenton and Princeton, Saratoga, Stony Point. That's not far from here. Cowpens. Whenever I get depressed, you just read about Cowpens. It's such a wonderful. And many others before finally securing victory in war at the siege of Yorktown. So victory at Saratoga in 1777 encouraged the French to join the fight on the American side, not because they believed in the American cause, far from it, but to reinforce the colonies enough to keep their battle going and to keep their enemy Britain occupied in the difficulties of an ongoing fight. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It is possible to state categorically that we could never have won the revolution without French aid. And I'll say this categorically. I resent the fact that in school in America in the 1950s and 60s, I was not told we could not have won the revolution without the French. I was told that they helped us, but not that we could not have won the victory without the French. The siege of Yorktown to happen required a navy to box in Cornwallis, who had got himself on a peninsula into the York River, and it required an army with a knowledge of siege operations. So he's boxed in by the French Navy. We don't have a navy. And then you need a knowledge of siege operations to slowly tighten the noose on Yorktown. We had no knowledge of siege operations. We had no engineers. Okay. The French gave us both of those things. Is anybody French in this? Thank you. We applaud you. One person. All right. Now we need to take a moment to explore the ironies that out of a desire to replace Britain as the world's leading power, Bourbon France lent her money, her men, and her armaments in aid of a rebellion whose ideals, ideas, and principles would initiate the age of democratic revolution. Lord North, British Prime Minister, foresaw these potentially destructive political consequences. He actually said that if Europe did not support Britain, now it would one day find itself facing an America imbued with democratic fanaticism. So Lord North fell from power during the period of negotiating the terms of the treaty. What many Americans fail to realize is the sheer brutality of it. So actually our alliance with France was our very first alliance and the very first time foreign country recognized our sovereignty. But many Americans today fail to realize the sheer brutality of this. We often imagine the American Revolution as a patriotic fight for high and light things. You see all the white men standing in rooms with like paper and they're all dressed up, right? It's not the war's that they were constantly unified as a whole one nation behind Washington and his army. They were not. That victory was inevitable. take on board this point. There is no such thing as historical inevitability. Everything could have turned out. I'm asking you to contemplate now that the Continental Army spent a good portion of the war, especially in the early years, running from the British, sometimes wearing nothing more than dirty rags. When Washington and his army heroically crossed the Delaware, Christmas 1776, they then had to march 9 miles through deep snows, and many did not have shoes. There are many cases of what we today would call war crimes on both sides. Torture, wholesale execution of enemy prisoners, slaughter of soldiers who had surrendered, and massacres of civilians who supported the other side. These things happened more frequently than we'd like to admit. Although it has to be said, the majority of commanding officers on both sides condemned these actions and tried to take action to prevent them. There's one striking exception, and that's a guy named Lieutenant Banastre Tarleton. So he's leader of the British Dragoons, who in 1781 encouraged the murder of 170 Americans who surrendered at Waxhaw, South Carolina. So who in this room has watched or is in the process of watching the 6-part series of the American Revolution?
Yeah.
It's absolutely
Absolutely.
excellent. And actually, Elizabeth lent me the entire series so that I'd be up to speed.
I brought you the first episode.
Oh, good. 170. Can you imagine these guys have surrendered and they get hacked to death, bayoneted. It is infamously remembered as Tarleton's Corner. Okay. Now, what do you think happens when word spreads among the Americans that 170 of our guys surrendered and they got bayoneted through? What happens to the next
King's
time
Mountain.
Reds surrendered?
Oh, yeah.
So, Tarleton's Corner. You want to surrender? Here, take Tarleton's Corner. Frostbite, disease, starvation, desertion, and death were constants throughout the 8.5 years of this. Victory or death is not just a catchy saying, it's a reality. Victory was far from inevitable and only achieved through a miraculous combination, tactics, strategy, and authority. Once the French had joined the American side, this regional war for American independence would explode into a global conflict involving free and enslaved peoples of African and Caribbean descent, indigenous warriors from the frontier of North America, and the great European nations of France, Spain, and the Netherlands. Now, the American Revolution had been told to us pretending the indigenous peoples did not exist. So remember at the beginning, I talked about that massacre at Chaumont-Bigouin in French and Indian War. So basically what happens there is the Americans and Indian attacks the French, right? Washington's supposedly in charge of this. The French man in charge surrenders, and the indigenous person who this Frenchman had promised, you can have this land. He had given land to that tribe and completely went back on his word and dispossessed the tribe. So when this indigenous warrior sees this Frenchman, he takes his hatchet and opens the hit. And of course, everybody blames Washington. Well, guess what? The indigenous peoples were there. They had a stake in this country. They were losing land, okay? So we need to understand a new history of the American Revolution. So the European nations included France, Spain, the Netherlands, Holy Roman Empire, and even Imperial Russia. In fact, the largest battle of the global conflict in terms of number of combatants happened some 3,700 miles from America at the Great Siege of Gibraltar. Now, that lasted a period of 3.5 years without a single American combatant. The British Navy basically is so distracted in the Mediterranean over the siege of Gibraltar, is that they failed to bottom in the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse. And Admiral de Grasse is the leader of the French Navy, who then was able to bottom in Cornwallis and Yorktown. So Britain's fighting on too many fronts, and Yorktown happens. In 1777, Congress began to draft our nation's first constitution. So is that the first constitution? That's pretty terrible. So, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, these are not ratified until 1781. Maryland ratifies them. They finally unify us on a national level as Emperor IV, quite dramatically. So actually, the Articles of Confederation, of course, were terribly, terribly flawed. They were basically just an agreement by the states to stay together in perpetuity. The states weren't going to yield any power. And specifically, they did not yield to property tax. So that meant Congress is pretty much broke the whole time. The army's not going to get fed. It creates so many problems. But that leads directly to the Newburgh conspiracy. So at the end of the war, we nearly had a coup d'etat. The soldiers, the officers, that is to say, 150 officers stationed in Newburgh, hadn't been paid in a year. They were promised pensions in 1780. They hear rumors the war's going to be over. You're going to read the newspaper tomorrow, and the war's going to be over. And you're just going to get sent home without that year's pay you were promised, without the pension that you were promised by Congress 3 years earlier, right? Now, some of these guys, many of them, had gone into debt to feed their families because guess what? Your family has to eat whether you're getting paid your salary or not. And they basically, how do we deal with debt in the 18th century? Does anyone know? We send you
Debtor's
to
prison.
So these officers in the Continental Army actually faced debtor's prison if they didn't get their money. So Washington, how he did it, well, there's a wonderful story there, but it's a different story. You have to pay another $5. Basically faces them down. And it's one of the great moments in American history. So, in more ways than one, the American Revolution became a conflict of massive geopolitical, socioeconomic, and historical significance. From one random musket shot at Lexington in 1775 to the roaring artillery bombardments at Yorktown in 1781 to the final peace in Paris, 1783, our citizens, our nation, and indeed the world would be changed forever. So this year marks the 250th anniversary of a crucial time at the beginning of the American Revolution. Today, we celebrate the American Revolution as we understand the deeper significance of what it achieved. Question: was the war fought to realize the rousing battle cry that had sent Americans to war in 1776, that all men are created equal? No, it was literally true. But by successfully turning the page on monarchical government, Americans were poised with the adoption of the U.S. Constitution to realize the Enlightenment ideal that legitimate authority of government rests on the uncorrupted choice of the free people. This, as Lord North so presciently understood would happen, started a new epoch in world history, laid the groundwork for all subsequent fights for freedom, not only in America, but in many places throughout the world, which continue to this day. It's no stretch to argue that the American Revolution continues to this day. Thank you. I'll now take any questions. Anyone? Go ahead.
So, one of the things that I've heard is that, you know, a lot of the people that were the leaders of the country were the upper class, and many of them didn't really envision that common people in the street were going to become free and equal citizens to them. They were talking about a group of educated landholders that owned it. And in fact, the revolution, all these other people came and fought, and so they were like, well, yeah, I'm getting it too.
Yeah.
But can you say a little bit like,
Sure.
wasn't that part of the
Sure.
revolution too?
So when I talked about the components of the American population, okay, you could continue on to say that those people, these people who had fled oppression, poverty, religious persecution, et cetera, they turned their back on these aristocratic societies. They're living in the woods, they're farming, they're making a living, but they're free, right? These people, they're not going to be wealthy. They're going to be what in the 18th century you call the poor and middlings. Okay. And it's very true that when the United States is when the educated people are debating the Constitution, one of the things that comes up is property owners are going, well, we're not going to let guys that don't have property vote. That would be ridiculous. And all these guys had agreed. And then Benjamin Franklin stood up. And he was one of 15 children of a Boston candle maker. So this guy boiled fat of animals to make candles, okay? And Franklin had been one of the wealthiest men in his day, and famous throughout the world for his scientific experiments. And Franklin stood up and he said, you know what? We won the revolution on the backs of these guys. You better give them the right to vote. And he carried it out.
Mhm.
Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah, thank you.
As long as you're a white man. Well, baby steps.
That was that.
In a minute.
Question.
The Constitution, when they wrote it, did they ever think about, in quotes, the real people of America, the indigenous people? Did did the Constitution relate to them, or was it applicable to them?
Well, it could become applicable, but they certainly were not thinking of those people. They were thinking of those who were used to British institutions, So, yes.
From your perspective, how much of an influence were the Freemasons on the revolution?
I don't have that much of a perspective on that. Freemasonry, I don't think it was a huge amount then. And that all is going to explode later into the first decades of the 19th century, when somebody tries to open the case on the Freemasons. But the organizations that were closed were very suspect in those things. The Society of the Cincinnati, which is basically descendants of officers in the American Revolution, was, Washington was all for it. A lot of the officers were all for it. Benjamin Franklin, once again, who never needed anyone to tell him what he thought, was against it. So, and I think you could see Freemasonry under their like. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Anyone else? George.
No, you made a comment about that you said that nobody taught you in the 50s, that without the French. But obviously somebody must have known. I think the famous quote about our soldiers when they landed on the beaches in World War II saying, Lafayette, we are here, like
Yes.
to repay the debt. So I guess
Yeah, no, you're
it
absolutely.
was known.
George is reminding us of a very important recognition that the French helped us. And he's talking about the fact that when Pershing landed in Paris during the World War One, as he
One or
said,
two? It was one.
one, it was
One.
one.
Oh,
World War
okay.
One.
Yeah, Electric Pershing's World War One. As he's walking down with his troops in France, and he's just blocked by his virtues. So it's a very emotional thing. It's like that complete remembrance that they helped us. What I said was I was not taught that we would not have
Right.
one.
Right, right,
You know,
right.
so, and I wish I could talk to Sister Constantia, right?
I did. So we have a question on Zoom, and the question is, was tea more important than today in the US?
Yes, it was. Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely. Tea is hugely important in English culture, and then of course we were, adopted English culture. But I do lecture on historic horticulture, and
That'll be our next one, right?
Joan, it's all up to you. She's in charge. And tea is so important in the. I'll give you a sneak preview. Tea is so important in the British Exchequer as the 19th century starts. That 1/10 of all taxes paid into the British Exchequer were paid on tea. And consider that into the 1830s, China controlled the secret of tea. Only they knew which plant it was, how it was grown, how to process. And Britain, of course, is so reliant on it. There's all this British silver is going to China, right? And they want to put a stop to them. So, in one of the, just in case you thought I'd finish saying bad things about the British, they basically, to get one plant from the Chinese, they sell another plant, okay? And that is,
Yes.
so that's how they're going to fund tea, which of course is completely illegal in China. But they do two things. They hire Robert Fortune, who's a horticulturist and in charge of the Chelsea Physic Garden, one of the important early botanical gardens. Full disclosure, I went there on my honeymoon with my wife. And they sent him into China at a time when it's forbidden for Westerners to be in China. He disguises himself and he steals the secret of tea.
Huh.
So, to be continued. Any other questions?
Hi, you showed a photo of the First Continental Congress, like at the building. Where was that?
Well, that's it's Carpenter's Hall.
Carpenter's Hall.
Carpenter's Hall, it's still there.
Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia, yeah.
Philadelphia.
Yeah, so Philadelphia was the intellectual center of America until the beginning of the 19th century. So it's not until the Erie Canal, right, starts sending wealth down the Hudson River that New York explodes into importance. At the time of the Revolution, there's 15,000 population in Boston, 25,000 in New York, and 40,000 in Boston. But Boston has all the institutions. Remember, Benjamin Franklin had gone there. He gets himself a competence, right? And he starts institutions. He says, now that we have money, we can start learning. Okay, so he founds the American Philosophical Society in 1743 to aid American science. All right, and all these institutions are all influenced. Any other questions?
It's a quick semantics question.
Okay.
Why, when battles happen in Boston and Lexington, Concord, do we say they're at Boston or at Lexington as opposed to in Boston or in Lexington? I've always wondered that, and I don't
It's a
know.
good question.
Okay.
I wish Sister Constantia were here. I think you've said either. Did you misunderstand what I meant?
No, not at all. But
Yeah.
whenever there is in the Revolutionary War or the Civil War, any of the battle sites, it's always at Gettysburg or at Boston or at Bunker Hill,
Mhm.
and not in
I mean, when you think of it, it's just a word. Talk about semantics. It's a word.
Yeah.
The battle isn't taking place in, or it's taking place in a place. So that would be an action, right?
Yeah, I just feel like that seems very specifically to battle things as opposed to tourism or visits or educational institutions or this, like we don't say the Philosophical Society at Boston.
Yeah.
That's the Philosophical Society in Boston.
Yeah.
So I just was wondering if there was.
Yeah. So in
something
that
else
case, you're
interesting.
going into a place, an American philosophical system. So
Could it? Thanks.
did that answer your question?
I still don't have an answer for it, but that's the.
Could it be because the battles you need space and so they didn't go into the city, they were on the outskirts of?
That's not it at all. No, basically it's just which preposition do you want to use? And the question is anybody misunderstanding if you say interact?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
No.
So, any other questions?
So prior to the 7 Years' War, we had our assemblies in each of the colonies. Were there any murmurings of rebellion or leaving the British, or were we really comfortable having the support of the biggest empire in the world and strongest empire?
No, we absolutely were very comfortable with that. However, it needs to be said that the British treated us as second-class citizens. So George Washington was a fine figure of a man. He was a great soldier. He tried to join the British Army and they wouldn't accept him. They just thought he's a provincial. He's not good. Okay. And, there's a sense that Washington and a lot of people feel, treated as second-class citizens by the British. So while we want them, it's complicated.
And so speaking of Washington, so as far as the British troops in the colonies, were most of them from the Britain, or did they actually use colonists to be part of
Well, in the
like in the 7 Year War?
They use.
So those were British soldiers and American colonists. So each colony is going to have its militia. So Washington is in the Virginia militia, and he's going to be captaining a troop. And all of the colonies are going to be contributing, which is why, the British, I said, they're grateful for the help that the American colonists had given during the French. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. If there's one.
I was just wondering, you're talking about the first stirrings of independence and liberty. What prompted at least Franklin to go and think about the Albany Plan of Union before the French and Indian War? What was the promptings in the colonies that even had somebody say, why don't we try this rudimentary plan to get together?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So Franklin was very sagacious. He saw things that other people didn't see. And he saw that 13 colonies, you think you're New England, or you think you're a Pennsylvania, you think you're a Virginian, you think you're a Maryland, or you think you're a North Carolina. And he saw that the sense of identity was to the colony, not to the nation. There was no sense of America, and he comes up with that famous cartoon, Join or Die, where he depicts a serpent in 13 parts. And he's basically saying, unless you get it together, guys, you're gonna die, because you got to stand together. And needless to say, nobody paid any attention to him until, such time as they were encouraged to think it was a good idea. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yes, it makes sense.
On a lighter note, you've seen the play 1776.
I saw it when it was first on Broadway. So
What did you think of it?
I thought it was wonderful.
It's my favorite movie.
Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful.
My wife gets tired of me reciting this one.
It's absolutely yeah. So one of the fellow interpreters of my Washington's Head was absolutely loved that play. And, I still remember, I need to find the words of that song, like pins or saltpeter. Yeah.
Molasses.
To run to slaves.
It's
Sit
been,
down,
it's been a
Johnny.
long time. 1776 is like 50 years.
Yeah, actually, I had a great history teacher back when it was called history. Mr. Waymeyer said that the Declaration of Independence was actually signed on July 2nd, not the 4th. It was dated the 4th. And the reason being, she gave the people independence a chance to get back so that the nation would then be informed, essentially all at once.
So basically, it was finished being written on the 2nd. It was agreed on. It wasn't signed until August 9th.
Yeah.
And then there's what's known as an engrossed copy. So that's when you have the guy with or the girl with the good handwriting, making a beautiful copy. And but a peculiarity of Declaration of Independence, if you want a little piece of trivia, is there's no place where it's just called the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
It states what it's about, but it never says the Declaration. But that's, you have to pay another $5 to get that. Any other questions? Yes, Cole.
Can you tell us more about Washington's headquarters, what we could see there if we were to make the quick trip up to Newburgh?
Sure. So Washington's headquarters is one of, and I'm actually going to, in that right outside, Cole set up a bench or something where we have brochures for many of the state historic sites. So Washington's headquarters was the very first publicly owned historic site in America, which meant that from the time the state bought it in 1850, Americans could tour it. So Washington lives here between April 1st, 1782 and August 19th, 1783, at which point the Continental Army is getting disbanded. I want to say you can see it today, but you can't because it's actually closed for restoration. The building's 275 years old. It was built between 1750 and 1770, first owned by Jonathan and Trinch of Hasbrook. So Trinch is Dutch for Catherine. We don't say they built it. There were 5 enslaved. So who did the heavy lifting is anybody's guess. Washington is going to live here with his wife, Martha, his servants. He's got an enslaved black valet named William Lee. There'll be 6 aides de camp because this is Army headquarters. So the Army will be 4 miles away at Newburgh, which is fairly typical. If you've ever been to the headquarters in Morristown, it's the Ford Mansion, and then 4 miles away is Jockey Club. There's also going to be 60 Commander-in-Chief's guards here because you do not want Washington taken hostage and used as a war engine. Right now, what you can see is because we were the first historic site and got a lot of donations for 1,300 objects are overflowing that little Dutch house, right? In 1910, we built a museum, and that is open now. We have 1,300 objects. We have exhibitions to do. One of our treasures is the pieces of the boom, which was part of the instructions in the Hudson Bridge, which secured the Hudson against the rivers. Remember, they have the greatest navy in the world, and there's a river that stretches 150 miles, or a river corridor, that is to say, from New York Harbor all the way to Canada. And this is a problem. How do you keep the greatest navy in the world from taking this river? Because if they'd taken the river, they could have separated the New England states from the Mid-Atlantic and Southern states, and the war would have been over very quickly. Most of the men to fight the war come from the women. Remember, the majority of able-bodied men in the South are black and enslaved. So the way we secure the Hudson is building West Point. And we needed a Polish engineer, Thaddeus Kosciuszko, to help us do that because we had no engineers. Anyhow, it's worth coming to see. So we have part of the boom. We have a bust of Washington with a face taken from a life mask made by Gauguin, the great French sculptor. we've got a copy of the Lansdowne portrait of Washington. And we give basically virtual tours, a slide lecture of the rooms of the house. We talk about how they were used when Washington was here. He did some important things. And I suggest you come. Okay.
Renovation.
Well, now we come to the sad fact that New York State's in charge of it. So they closed the house on August 18th. They haven't done anything.
Oh, no.
They haven't the yellow tape saying stay away.
Oh,
So it should be ready by do you think I'm gonna tell you when it's gonna be ready? Ready by July. I won't commit. Ask Kathy Hope. Any other questions? So there's also out there maps which with information about all the historic sites in the Hudson Valley. I suggest you take one because a lot of these places are free to visit if you're interested. It would be a great thing to do during this 250th year. Any other things?